Good evening and welcome. My name is James Neiman, president of the seminary, and it is my pleasure to welcome you to the 2024 Vine Deloria Junior Theological Symposium. Before saying more about tonight's event, let me note that November is National Native American Heritage Month. During this month, we honor the culture, traditions, and achievements of Native Americans, Alaska Natives, Native Hawaiians, and affiliated island communities. We also acknowledge tonight that our school stands on the lands of the Potawatomi, Miami, and Peoria peoples. For thousands of years before their forced removal, this was their traditional homeland, and it continues to hold their ancestral stories and wisdom. We honor and thank the elders of these and other nations, past and present. These lands are still home to many indigenous peoples, and we are grateful to learn in this place. In 2013, the annual American Indian and Alaska Native Symposium at LSTC was renamed in honor of Vine Deloria Jr., an alumnus of Augustana Seminary in Rock Island, Illinois, one of our 6 predecessor schools. The symposium has been held in November every year since it began back 16 years ago, and is co-sponsored by the Perros Center for Intersectionality Studies at LSTC and ELCA's Indigenous Ministries, the ELCA's Indigenous Ministries and Tribal Relations Office. This year, an anonymous donor has also assisted with supporting and sponsoring the event. The focus of this year's symposium is Vine Deloria's first book, Custer Died for Your Sins, an American Indian Manifesto, published in 1988, where he highlights the challenges of Indigenous people, challenges that unfortunately remain all too relevant today. For the past 5 years, this symposium has been organized by the ELCA's Director of Indigenous Ministries and Tribal Relations, Mr. Vance Blackfox. Mr. Blackfox is an Indigenous theologian and citizen of the Cherokee Nation. An alumnus of Texas Lutheran University and LSTC, he has served the ELCA in multiple capacities, from national president of the Lutheran Youth Organization during his TLU days, to later working as a diversity and cultural education professional for the women of the ELCA, Augustana Fortress Publishers, California Lutheran University, the ELCA Youth Gathering, and LSTC's Youth in Mission program. In addition to serving numerous ELCA and ecumenical teams and committees, he is presently the Indigenous theologian and coordinating team member for the ELCA's Theological Roundtable, the founder and director of Otherwise, a multicultural education and cultural immersion program for youth and student groups from across the country. It's our honor to have him with us tonight. I welcome Mr. Blackfox to introduce this evening's panelists.
Thank you, Dr. Neiman. It's good to see you. And it's good to be back on campus, even if virtually this evening. For those of you who were able to join us yesterday, you know that we had some virtual and in-person event, having had a wonderful lecture and symposium worship or chapel service. And so happy to be back here doing all this good study and good conversation around Vine's legacy. And this year, as you've mentioned, around Custer Died for Your Sins. Just a little background for Custer. We are encouraged and have been encouraged for a few years now by the late Reverend Marlene White Rabbit Helgamo, who was also a voice in the development of this symposium all those years ago. But she, over the last few years before she walked on, encouraged us to think about what would it mean for the entire church, the Lutheran Church in particular, but everybody, to be reading Vine Deloria's Custer Died for Your Sins. And so as she continues to talk to me in my ear, but also me listening to the gifts that she offers to us even before she walked on, it was important for us to think about, well, how could we potentially have Custer Died for Your Sins be centered? And so we created the reading circle, the Truth and Healing Movement reading circle. And so there are congregations across the country who are taking part in this reading of Vine's book, as well as having group discussion. And so we're really excited and thankful for that. We'll encourage that reading circle through the next months. And so hopefully others will take part in that activity. It's also important to note here that one of our friends and fellow Lutherans, if you will, sometimes it's important to recognize those who are doing all the work in the background, who are willing to do that work, and that would be Sarah Beams, who is Choctaw, and has been the person who authored our study guide. The discussion guide, I should say, for the Custer Died for Your Sins. And so thank you, Sarah, for that work. And many people, I believe, are appreciating all the work that you put into that to guide us through these conversations. And so thank you, Sarah. This evening, what I'd like to do is first say once again, thank you to LSTC and the Perro Center for Intersectional Studies and to the planning team of the symposium for all the good work that we've been able to do to get ready for this year's symposium. I believe that if we were in person, I'd ask for a big round of applause. But where you're sitting, if you just if you could just maybe offer some heartfelt appreciation through this virtual means, I'd appreciate it for all those who have worked hard on this. Marvis and Christian at LSTC, along with the IT staff, and then our production staff at the ELCA, Brett Nelson and Jason O'Neill and Gabe Woundedhead, and Wanda Frenchman, who serves on the team, as well as Justice Nichols, both of whom serve on the staff at the ELCA with me, and Indigenous Ministries and Tribal Relations. Just thank you so much for your hard work. And with that being said, I'd like to introduce now our panelists for this evening. Thank you to the three of them who have made the efforts to be ready and be here to have conversation about Custer Died for Your Sins and all things related to Vine as necessary. And so I want to introduce the three of them. And we will start this evening by introducing Pastor Manuel Retamoza. Pastor Manuel Retamoza is the pastor at St. Andrew's Lutheran Church in San Diego. He also serves as a program director for the ELCA's Youth Ministry Network Extravaganza, as the vice president of American Indian Alaska Native Lutheran Association of the ELCA, as a co-chair of the ELCA's repudiation of the Doctrine of Discovery Task Force, and also serves as a wisdom keeper and instructor at our newly formed Theological Education for Indigenous Leaders hosted at Pacific Lutheran Theological Seminary, where he also serves as an advisory board member to that seminary. So thank you, Pastor Manuel, for being here this evening. And then we'll also introduce this evening a dear friend and colleague, Allie Redhorse Young. She's a citizen of the Navajo Nation, is a founder and director of Protect the Sacred. She launched the Protect the Sacred to educate and empower the next generation of Native leaders and allies. She ensures Native voices, especially Indigenous youth and women, are central in culture and policy. Allie aims to replace the fabricated American narrative with authentic stories of her people, the original storytellers of this land. Also important to note that she played a vital role in the turnout of voters on the Navajo Nation and throughout Indian country, having even recently been acknowledged by President Barack Obama for her efforts. And so that was exciting for all of us to see. So Allie, thank you for being here and really appreciate it. And then we have another friend who's returning to the symposium. Dr. David Martinez was a previous lecturer for the symposium. And so we're grateful for the return of Dr. Martinez, who is Akimel Odom and Hia-Ced Odom in Mexican, professor of American Indian Studies and Transborder Studies, is the author of Dakota philosopher Charles Eastman and American Indian Thought, Life of the Indigenous Mind, Vine Deloria and the Birth of the Red Power Movement, which was published in 2019. It doesn't seem like it was that long ago, David. That's amazing. Great book, so we need to check that out too. He also published My Heart is Bound Up with Them, How Carlos Montezuma Became the Voice of a Generation, published last year, and is editor of the American Indian Intellectual Tradition, an anthology of the writings from 1772 to 1972. Professor Martinez is also the director and founder of the Institute of Transborder Indigenous Nations, which is housed in the School of Transborder Studies, where it focuses on the indigenous nations impacted by the U.S.-Mexico border. So thank you to our panelists, and welcome back to those of you who have also served in other capacities. I think Pastor Manuel has also been our preacher in the past for the symposium, and so we're just so grateful to have all of you here. So just for housekeeping's sake, if you have questions this evening, please find the Q&A button. Sometimes it's up front at the bottom of your screen, and sometimes it is, you have to go to the More button, then you'll find the Q&A there. So certainly feel free to use the chat, but when you have a question, please put those in the Q&A section of the Zoom tools there. I'd appreciate that. One second, please. So we have a variety of questions, and some of the questions will be questions that I think just need to be asked. And then we have questions that are also taken from the discussion guide that was produced for us by Sarah Beams. And so we're going to go through these questions, and we'll have time for question and answer at the end, as I've stated. And so just really excited to be having this conversation with you folks. And so we will begin with the questions. Our first question is a question for all of you, and it's important to note here that all of you, while having some shared experiences because you're all Indigenous peoples, you also are people who serve in a variety of capacities in different places, different sectors, if you will. And so you do, as you come from those different perspectives and different places in your daily work, I'm curious to know, how might Custer Died for Your Sins be significant to the work you do and the sector you find yourself serving? And we're going to start with Pastor Manuel this evening.
Thank you, Vance. I mean, because I do work in the church, obviously, and do so much work in the church, and his both in the chapter about missionaries and our people, and then in the final chapter as well, he does wrap up quite a bit for us that is still relevant for us and speaks to us in a very prophetic way to us as a church, especially the ELCA. There are places in which I could see some hopefulness that things have changed in my lifetime since the book was first published. In other ways that much of it has not changed for us as a church. And so it's opened up some windows, perspectives for me in my work and the challenges that we have before us.
Okay, great, fantastic. And then we'll go to Allie. I'll ask the question again. Allie, serving in an activism and organizing role in her life amongst many other places and roles. How might Custer Died for Your Sins be significant to the work that you do in the sector you find yourself serving?
Yeah, thank you so much. I think, I mean, it was, such a great book and just so relevant to today. I think one thing that stood out for me that applies to the work that I do is around research. And coming off of the election, there was large dispute about the exit polls and the data that was collected of Native peoples across this country. And, the inaccuracy of that told one story. And, now folks are speaking out about, how inaccurate the data that was collected was. and does not tell an accurate story of us. And I think that's something that, you know, Vine was getting across, and it continues to happen to this day. And that is one thing that continues to keep us invisible and our power as well. And so that's something, you know, that I want to continue working towards in my own work around like data sovereignty and really accurately reflecting Indigenous peoples, you know, from our communities, and making sure that that research comes from our people. You know, sure, collaboration is that's one thing I do in my work, is I encourage allies to work with us and collaborate with us. But, you know, I think the teaching here is that we have to be very careful about that.
Sure, absolutely. Thank you. And it was just impressive to watch you and Protect the Sacred and all those who were on the ground moving around. So for those of you who are not following Protect the Sacred, or go back and look at their social media and see all the incredible activity that was happening over these last months. So thank you, Allie. All right, David, how about you? So just to remind you folks, David's written a book on Vine. So this question may be a little maybe not right on spot on, so we'll give David a lot of freedom here, a lot of grace. But how might Custer Died for Your Sins be significant to the work that you do and the sector that you find yourself serving there in the academy?
Well, as a teacher, not just a scholar, but as a teacher in American Indian Studies, Vine's work is central to all that I do. And I want to begin by pointing out that Custer was published in 1969, 1988. And that's important because that book appeared at a time when the country was not only seeing the Rep Power movement, in full strength, but also this notion of Indian nationalism and tribes as nations was becoming a driving idea. And Vine is largely responsible for that discourse. And one might argue, and I think I argue in my book, that Vine basically invented American Indian Studies with Custer, with God is Red, with Behind the Trail of Broken Treaties. And so a lot of the topics, a lot of the issues, a lot of the discourses that inform American Indian Studies today, or Indigenous Studies and American Studies, was initiated by books like Custer. And so our critique of anthropology, our critique of Indian-Christian relations, our critique of Indian stereotypes, a lot of these topics were initiated in that groundbreaking work. And while Vine's work is not necessarily cited today as much as it was, say, when I was a student, and Vine was very much alive and influencing all of us, still, as a historic figure, I find that Vine's relevancy, even to young people taking my classes today in the 2020s, they still find a lot of value in his work. It's incredible to listen to 19, 20, 21-year-olds, read Vine's work, and just are amazed that what he said some 60 years ago is still relevant today. And that says a lot to his legacy, that his ideas and opinions haven't become dated at all. And in many ways, they're new, and they're influential all over again. Because just as his generation had to deal with, the Vietnam War and Dick Nixon, we're having to deal today, with the war on terrorism, the border crisis, and Donald Trump. And so the challenges to Indigenous people today is just as great as it ever was. So Vine's Indian nationalist rhetoric, is just as meaningful and impactful as it ever was.
Yes, thank you. And thank you for mentioning that it was published in the 60s. And that also important for us to recognize, and part of our conversations in the book studies, or the reading circles rather, are to remember that the things that were happening in the 60s when he was writing, while may not be exactly what's happening today, but certainly some of those things are certainly very much alive. The challenges and opportunities for us to maintain our sovereignty, if you will, is still very much happening. So thank you for affirming that for us. Great. Another question that I would love to hear from each of you about is digging little deeper into the book itself. But was there a significant chapter or paragraph or passage in Custer Died for Your Sins that you feel is important for us to pay attention to? And what was that, and why was it significant to you? We'll start with Manuel again.
I think you're muted.
Thank you. Yeah. Yeah, of course, in chapter 5, one of the quotes that I pulled from is he writes, while the thrust of Christian missions was to save the individual Indian, its result was to shatter Indian societies, destroy the cohesiveness of the Indian communities. Tribes that rested the overtures of the missionaries seemed to survive. Tribes that converted were never heard from again. Where Christianity failed insofar as it failed, Indians were able to withstand the cultural deluge that threatened to engulf them. That has stayed with me. I mean, if it wasn't entire tribes that kind of disappeared, there were parts of our own story that were disappeared, that were erased as people through the work of the church and its missionaries. And for me, there's a deep sadness in that for our family and the stories that were lost through that missionization and colonization that happened. And there's no way to retrieve that now, only in the ways that I can now pull at little threads and try and weave my story and my faith and bring it together somehow, but it's just fragmented and fairly threadbare.
Yeah, thank you very much,
Thank
Pastor.
you.
Yeah. All right, Allie, was there a passage or chapter that was significant for you, and why was it significant to you?
All right. Yeah, I think Indian humor was great. Is really pointing to the self-deprecation of our community and arguing that it's really like a survival strategy and coping mechanism for Indigenous communities, and that's really real. And that it really struck me because Vance knows that I have worked in Hollywood and still have aspirations of writing television. And so reading that, I thought about reservation dogs and smoke signals and all of these amazing pop culture depictions of Native peoples and communities. And you can tell that we do rely on that kind of Indian humor. And it's a way that we relate to one another, and it's actually very beautiful within our communities, and when we exchange that kind of humor. And myself being a writer and wanting to write television, I have also relied on Indian humor in some of the things that I've written. So I just think it was I related to it a lot, and I think that it was like he hit the nail on the head.
Indeed, thank you. Yeah, Allie and I share some of that humor on occasion when we're in the same places together, or just by text sometimes. So thank you for being that humorous partner with me at times. David, you read all his works.
Yes.
And
Yes.
so in this one,
Yeah.
what's a significant passage or chapter for you?
Well, perhaps a little predictably, when I think about Custer and his personal meaning for me, I think chapter 4, which is the one on anthropologists, which is probably the most cited chapter in the whole book. It's probably overly cited. However, I should point out with respect to the passage that is meaningful to me, I read his book for the first time when I was a community college student. So, I'm 19, 20 years old. And so I'm reading this for the first time, and of course, like any young person, I'm just completely blown away, by this man, this book, and the way that he thinks. So in chapter 4, the reason it's so meaningful to me is not only because of the topic of anthropology and what he says about anthropology as a social science, but he mentions the Gila River Pima in that chapter. And so that's the historic name of my community. And so the Gila Indian community, often they would say Gila River Pima. And so when I came across that reference, just a passing reference, I felt affirmed. I felt seen. I had never read anything before in my 19 to 20 years at that point that talked about my people. And so that meant a lot to me. And of course, I had to be a native man, a native thinker that would see a community like mine as worth mentioning. I don't remember what he said exactly, but what I do recollect is that the reason why we came up in this chapter in the first place is that one of Vine's criticisms of anthropology is that they don't seem to focus on those issues and topics that matter to the community the most, the Indian community the most. And so he was criticizing all kinds of anthropologists for focusing on things like war dances and scalp dances and 19th century versions of native culture. And he was mad at them for not doing anything relevant to what was going on in the Indian community as of the late 1960s, which was being devastated by termination policy, which was dealing with government-made poverty on the reservation. So that's where we come into the picture. Vine pointed out the struggles that the Gila River community was confronting as a desert tribe that was being created by the federal government, but anthropologists didn't seem to be interested. And so Vine was asking, well, why don't they study the origin of Indian poverty? Why don't they get to the root of what's going on in our community instead of worrying about, how many beads and feathers we're wearing? And so it's in that context, I was just like, he's talking about my family. And it's strange. I mean, he's talking about our hardship. But at the same time, as a young person, I was overjoyed by this because it's finally like we weren't invisible anymore, which is a common problem for us all, right? Invisibility. And so you never know what that means until somebody finally sees you and says your name.
No, I really appreciate that. And my brother, Pastor Manuel there, and I, of course, are Cherokee. And so, at least we make the cut with the Trail of Tears in our little history books in the 2nd grade and the 5th grade and the 7th grade and 11th grade. But I was always wondering, where's everybody else? And why is this the only thing that's significant as a young person? And so I love that you had that experience with Vine from a very early moment in your young adult life. I appreciate that story. It's good. Well, folks, we're going to ask some questions from our study guide or discussion guide. I have one question picked out for each of them, but may ask them to respond to those questions after the initial response. And the first question, of course, is for Pastor Manuel. We'll do that again. And the question in the discussion guide that I want Pastor Manuel to think about and maybe reflect on is, according to Deloria, quote, the largest difference between Indian religion and Christian religions is the interpersonal relationships, end quote, as, quote, Indian religion taught that sharing one's goods with another human being was the highest form of behavior, end quote. What are some similarities between the Indian religion Deloria describes and the teachings of Jesus? What can Christians learn from indigenous ways of life and spirituality?
Yeah, well, to answer that first part of that question, that sharing of one's in the Bible, it's translated in English as goods, often, particularly end of Acts 2, but it's all throughout the Bible, how what it is to be a follower of the way at the time in the early church, when we didn't have necessarily liturgy or order in the church, but people were gathering to pray and sing songs and to bring together, sell what they had and give it away to the poor, to those in need, and that everybody was taken care of, was it just, to me, it is my understanding of what it is to be, what it was or is to be native on this continent. Also the idea that, I mean, we especially Lutherans, talk a lot about gospel to them law too. And how he wrote about the law, and especially in native ways, that there wasn't law in the way we understand it. It was kind of was doing something out of your own, how do you put it? I didn't write it down, but it was like out of your own individual need instead of looking out for the needs of others, and how people would be, I don't want to say frowned upon. Man, I wish I could remember his wording for it, but it was very much more how I understand how I understand grace too. That there was a lot of grace among our people. And when I say people, I'm not talking about just our Cherokee people, but our tribes here on Turtle Island.
Certainly.
Thank you.
Yeah, thank you. So not knowing how comfortable David or Allie is interested or comfortable you are talking about the church and all those things. We've had conversation individually, but want to open this up to you if either of you have a response. If not, that's fine, but want to give you a chance to respond as well to this particular question.
Can you reiterate it for me?
Yeah, I can read it again. According to Deloria, the largest difference between Indian religion and Christian religions is the interpersonal relationships, as Indian religion taught that sharing one's goods with one another, or with another human being, rather, was the highest form of behavior. What are some similarities between the Indian religion Deloria describes and the teachings of Jesus? What can Christians learn from indigenous ways of life and spirituality?
Oh, well, geez. I suppose the first thing that comes to mind is, well, actually not something that Vine said, but Vine appreciated in his ancestor, Charles Eastman, who wrote about Christianity in the Native community during his generation. And what Eastman taught, and this is a teaching from the elders that he talked to, is that, well, after Eastman, he was trying to advocate for the YMCA when it was actually a Christian organization. So he would go out to reservations and he would explain to people what the organization is about, and how its mission, is the spread of the gospel and the word of Jesus. So I think it's in the Wichita tribe that they asked Eastman to explain what Jesus's teachings are. And so Eastman made reference to, let's see, what's the tradition? The blessed are this and that. There's actually a name
The
for that.
Beatitudes?
The Beatitudes. Thank you. He talked about the Beatitudes, and after going over the Beatitudes, this Wichita elder said, when you think about it, this Jesus was an Indian, because we already practice these things in our community, sharing love for our brother. And I would say that a lot of that is in Vine's regard for the church. He had a great respect for his father, who was a minister. And I think he had a lot of great respect for all people working for the church, especially Indian churches that were trying to spread this message around to people that had endured a lot of oppression of their own spirituality. You know, my grandfather was a Presbyterian minister for 40 years. And so that's what he tried providing our community. You know, because our Otham Way, our Otham Hindag had been oppressed a lot. And so a lot of people turned to the church, you know, for teachings. And in particular, I think what resonated with members of my community, you know, that adopted the Jesus way were those parts of Christianity, the parts of Jesus' teaching that resonated with them as Indian people. And so I would say that, and hopefully I'm answering your question,
Yeah.
that if there's any way of answering this question correctly, I would say that you would have to look at how Indian people, you know, have adopted Christianity into their own communities, you know, and embraced it as their own, not as a message of an alien church. So that was the other side of Vine's criticism. You know, he was very critical of the church as a political body, you know, that was part of our colonization. And he was very aware of that aspect. But he was also aware that Indian people have a way of taking these alien elements and making them their own, and I guess you could say indigenizing them.
Mm-hmm.
You know, and so when I think about your question, I think about my grandfather, you know, out on the reservation, you know, preaching in this little church, you know, providing for his congregation. And so that became a gathering site for the community.
Mm-hmm.
And so it was a place where you could go and see relatives. You know, it's a place where you could go and gather for a feast. You know, it's a place where you could go and you'd be surrounded by our sacred mountains.
Mm-hmm.
You know, and so if the church, my grandfather's little church in Gila Crossing had any value, it's because of what it was able to allow us to retain from the old ways.
Mm-hmm. Indeed. Thank you very much. I love that. And I see Manuel and I shaking our heads because we work so closely with, you know, Indigenous communities and Indigenous ministries here in our own church. And so, and with students who are Indigenous that are going to be leading some of these ministries. And these are the conversations that we're having. And so I might need to bring David Martinez into the room for theological education for Indigenous leaders at some time. So thank you, David.
Thank you.
All right, so another question from our discussion guide. This one will be for Allie. And again, this is a very long question, and there are multiple questions in this one question, but again, it was written so that discussion could happen in a right way. So I don't expect you to answer all the questions, Allie, but to use this as a guide for, or pick a question, or to use this as a guide for your thoughts. But the question is, it's a long one. In the chapter, Indians Today, Deloria states that Indians are probably invisible because of the tremendous amount of misinformation about them. What are some examples of misinformation we see today, and how does it contribute to making Native peoples invisible? What can be done to combat it? What role can the government play in spreading and stopping misrepresentation of Indigenous peoples? What about the media, sports industry, and entertainment? What about the church? What role can you play personally? So you've already kind of mentioned a little bit in this regard, but we'd love to hear some more thoughts from you.
Yeah, thank you. Yeah, I mentioned, you know, coming off of the election, the exit polls, and, you know, some of that misinformation, but also I also mentioned I worked for a little bit in Hollywood, and certainly, I always say that the negative stereotypes of our people were birthed in cinema, and so very much so, across mainstream media up until a few years ago when Native creatives actually, broke through in the industry, and are correcting a lot of those of that misinformation and those negative stereotypes. But certainly across mainstream media, Hollywood Westerns, textbooks, just about everything. And I apologize, I had some dental work today, so I'm like trying to speak. So and frankly, it's been hurtful. I think there was a question around media, sports industry, and entertainment. We're still up against we're still fighting against many of those corporations and industries that exist. For example, in sports, you had a great win with the Washington football team, but still, we're up against many other mascots and teams that that are really, demeaning our culture, and in the ways that they are stereotyping us, our songs, our traditions, our regalia, etc. And then I think also the role that the government is playing in spreading and stopping the misrepresentation of Indigenous peoples. I think we saw some great progress in the last 4 years with Secretary Deb Haaland, who served as the Secretary of the Interior, and really bringing our issues to the forefront and helping to to speak about them on a national level, on a federal level. And just a few weeks ago, President Biden issued an apology to Native Americans in this country for the federal boarding school system and their role in that. And so and I would say, that was a huge role by the government in spreading the misinformation. By really the agenda there was assimilation and erasing culture from taking it away from our young people, and so it would not continue for the generations to come. And that was a tactic to really this cultural genocide that happened in this country. And so I think the role that the church can play, that the government can play, there's an issue around critical race theory in schools, and many people have an issue with it because it is really about teaching the truth from all of the marginalized communities across this country, and the histories that have long been swept under the rug by the federal government. And so, for the government to implement critical race theory into the education system would be something that I obviously support. For churches, I think really talking about the role of churches, and even within the federal boarding school system, with about manifest destiny, and how expanding westward in the name of God is really was it was lending a hand to the genocide that happened to our people, or to Native Americans in this country. So all of those things, it's a lot of work. It's centuries of work to combat that kind of misinformation, but it's vital that we are no longer invisible, and that these stories are coming, they are authentic, and that they are coming from our communities, the storytellers, as you mentioned in my bio, the original storytellers of this land. I think when we can do that, when we can amplify artists like Vine Deloria and his work, his writing, when we can share with our friends, have you seen Reservation Dogs? Check it out. It's on Hulu. Things like that. It's very important to make sure that Native peoples in this country are no longer invisible, and that you're hearing our history from us, from our communities, and from the talented people, scholars, artists that we are. And so, yeah, there's a lot of work to do. And I'm proud to say that, for the first time in a really long time, we've made a lot of progress in the political landscape in Hollywood, just really across the board. So what I can say is continue supporting folks on this call, people like Manuel and Vance, who are doing this work in the churches. It's really important, because I think it's going to help us move forward as a society, really, because when we can introduce Indigenous ancestral wisdom into all of these conversations, I think the better off we'll be.
Indeed. Thank you very much, Allie. That was beautiful. And to just so you know, our lecturer yesterday is writing about CRT and working with one of the newest, or maybe the one of the voices of CRT. His partner is one of the voices of CRT that's kind of leading that movement. And so I'll be sure to get you that link so you can watch that. It was pretty impressive yesterday. And so thank you for raising that up. And another time, it's important for us to hear, when we hear things duplicated, it's important for us to pay attention, folks. And so thank you for that, Allie. We're going to move to the next question here for the sake of time. And this question is for David. And so, man, I always get here, and y'all know this, who've been to this panel discussion before in the past, and all the subjects. It's like, I want to go for like 3 or 4 hours. I know the panelists don't, but I'm like, let's do 3 or 4. We don't have enough time to get all the things in ever. And so I'm just really grateful that we get to do what we get to do. So David, we will ask you this question. Throughout the book, Deloria discusses the mythological aspects of American history, not only in terms of the, quote, the mythical Indians of stereotype land, end quote, but also in the, quote, mythical generalities of what built this country and made it great, end quote. However, the author notes that both, quote, both white and Indians were buried under the weight of popular pseudo-history, end quote. What does he mean by this? While American mythology serves to erase Indigenous peoples, how does it also cheat white people? So Allie's kind of touched a little bit on this, but would love to hear your thoughts as well.
Yeah. Well, when you ask a question like that, I think about how Vine organized Custer. And so in the first chapter, that's where you have a chapter titled Indians of Today, the Real and the Unreal. And so this is where the infamous Cherokee princess appears and things of that nature, right? And so this is a common strategy in Vine's work. He often begins his books by referring to stereotypes, popular misconceptions that are clouding the topic or the issue that he wants to actually write about. And so in the case of how stereotypes and historic misconceptions are deployed in Custer, it's worth remembering that when this book came out in '69, he wanted to alert people about what was going on with termination policy. And so when you look at the structure of the book, the first 3 chapters, right after the stereotype chapter, chapter 1, you have a chapter on law and policy, and then you have a chapter on termination policy itself. And so the point of raising these issues of stereotypes and historic misunderstandings is to impress upon the reader that these things like stereotypes are not trivial. If you say, for example, bring up the stereotypes in popular cinema, which are important to reckon with, you might get the impression, if you didn't know any better, that, well, savage Indian warriors is just a Hollywood trope and we don't have to take it seriously. But here's the thing. Insofar as these tropes, these images are part of American culture, what Americans think they know about us, that should alert you to an issue with how these stereotypes, these images, inform other aspects of Indian-white relations. So, for example, in Custer, the reason for raising this issue at the beginning of the book is because he wants to get across to his reader that these stereotypes, aren't just part of the popular imagination. They're shaping federal Indian policy. And so the laws that have been passed by Congress, the court cases that have been decided by the Supreme Court, policy decisions by various presidents, you know, all of these, when you look at the fine print, all of these are based on popular stereotypes of Indian people. Whether we're savage warriors on the so-called frontier, whether we're warts of the government and domestic dependent nations, all of these are stereotypes of us, and either our inherent savageness or our inherent incompetence as adult human beings. And so the reason why we have the policies that we do coming out of Washington, including termination, is that these are all being shaped by these gross misconceptions of what's going on in our communities, who we are as a people, just distortion from top to bottom. And so as a result, when it comes to getting the federal government to fulfill its trust relationship, which is another aspect of Custer, what can you expect? The rhetorical question is, what can you expect from a federal government that believes that your whole people is vanishing, that you're a historic relic? Why would you expect the federal government to care about helping you build your nation or recovering your language when they think that, for all intent and purposes, you're fading away anyway? And so the issue for Americans in this relationship is that Americans are denying themselves the opportunity to not only learn something about themselves and their true history of how they treated us, which they should be thinking deeply about, and with a lot of remorse. But also it means that in the case of addressing issues like climate change, which is a huge issue right now, by stereotyping us and writing us off as being historically irrelevant, they're also cutting themselves off from learning about how to live properly in this land. Americans have no idea what to do. They're just destroying the earth like crazy. And they're trying to pretend that it doesn't matter. And so they're people who are running around with their heads cut off. And so the consequence is dire. It's just like the answer to this environmental crisis is right in front of them. But they can't see us because they're blinded by their own prejudice.
Indeed. Thank you
I'll
very much. Sorry.
speak a little to that. Can I add one quick thing?
Yeah.
I was looking for this quote from the chapter, the Red and the Black. He writes, but the understanding of the racial question does not ultimately involve understanding by either blacks or Indians. It involves the white man himself. He must examine his past. He must face the problems he has created within himself and within others. The white man must no longer project his fears and insecurities onto other groups, races, and communities. Before the white man can relate to others, he must forego the pleasure of defining them. The white man must learn to stop viewing history as a plot against himself.
Mm.
So I think that speaks to some of what you were saying, David, but also speaks into the political climate we're in today as well.
Yes, thank you for that.
Thank you, Pastor. Great. Well, just remember, folks, if you have any questions, you'll want to put those in the Q&A button now so we can ask some questions. We do have one more question for our panelists here, and then we'll go to some questions. And this one, some of you have touched on already and kind of given some direction, but we'll see what we come up with, okay? And the question is, and we'll start with Pastor Manuel again, where should we go from here? What do you think Vine would hope for us? In particular, what should the church take away from Vine's message to us in Custer, and what should the church be doing?
Well, the church, and when I speak of the church now, I'm speaking of the Evangelical Lutheran Church in America, is starting to do some things. I'll almost say finally starting to do some things to make that change. And I know a lot of this was established through and by Marlene Helgamo White Rabbit as well. And your work, Vance. One of the things that I am most excited about in our church is our theological education for Indigenous leaders, as we have 24 Native ministries, only four clergy serving in those ministries, and so serving as ministers. And so as through that theological education for Indigenous leaders, we're bringing up new leaders. And it's not just that, but it's that some of the requirements or hoops, or however you want to put it, for our leaders to had to jump over and get through. It's a lot of what I had to get through to be a pastor, are starting to kind of get peeled away. And they're starting to understand that it is to leave your family, leave your home, leave your community, to go to seminary for 4 years is to really lose yourself and leave who you are. And we're bringing up leaders who are able to come together, not isolated alone in their seminaries, but actually come together to support one another and to learn and to be leaders in our churches. Also with as we work through the repudiation of the Doctrine and Discovery Task Force, doing more education for our churches and for our people as well about what that repudiation means for us, and the basic understanding that we are still here, and we've always been here and will continue to be here, and the church is learning from us. And hopefully, my hope is the church is actually learning about itself through us as well. So
very good. Thank you
you
very
have a
much.
follow-up question? Okay, thank you.
Oh, did you want to answer some more? I'll let you answer some
No, we're good.
Okay. How about you, Allie? Do you have any thoughts? I know you're not a part of the ELCA, but you can talk about church generally, or just, well, actually, I take that back. I'm lying. Just so you folks know, Allie is a part of one of our teams, and I just now recollected that because we've not met in a few months. But Allie is a part of our environmental justice, eco justice, creation justice team to put together some potentially programming for, or maybe a fellowship for Indigenous young people who can actually help us do better in the ways in which David has just expressed. And so, sorry, Allie, for forgetting that and announcing that, but thank you for your work with us in that way. But hand that question over to you. What can the church be doing?
Yeah, I think I mean, continuing to talk about, the message of Custer, and really about, I think it comes down to this like self-reflection, and also examining, the legacy of the church, and it, like I mentioned earlier, the role that it played in not only cultural genocide, but really the genocide of Native Americans in this country. And that's it's hard to swallow that. and um for I think white America to swallow that, and even admit to that. But it's important, I think it's important um to really claim, that role, and then going forward, thinking about, okay, so what are some of the solutions, thinking about reparations, and how do we repair our relationship with Native Americans and build back this trust, because we are rightfully we rightfully do not trust a lot of these systems that exist in America, from churches to the government. And his Custer was instrumental in getting folks, adamant about self-determination and treaty enforcement. And that is something that is, it's hard for me to say that is really at stake moving forward in January and into the next 4 years. And it's hard to be hopeful at this time, as an organizer that fought very hard to protect our tribal sovereignty with our vote. But I think, where do we go from here is that Indigenous communities will need solidarity, and we will need allies moving forward. Especially with the way that Trump has talked about Indigenous peoples in the past, and has even taken away land from, the Mashpee Wampanoag. And, that was the beginning of, I think his intentions for Native Americans. And so I think what Vine would want for us is for Native Americans, is to continue our legacy of survival and resilience. So yeah.
Thank you, Allie. I love that very much. David, what could we be doing in church?
Well, I suppose, actually, Vine attempted to answer this question in God is Red. I forget which chapter exactly, but he laid out a plan for the church's future in Indian country. And he began by asking churches of every denomination to renounce their historic legacy, in doctrines like manifest destiny and the doctrine of discovery, to give a more honest account of their history in Indian country, and not just focus on individuals that they regard as exceptions to the rule, but all of the things that acknowledge all of the things that they did to, taking advantage of the privileged role that churches were given in the Indian community, such as what happened during Grant's peace policy with the Board of Indian Commissioners in assigning all reservations a missionary. So we got assigned the Presbyterian a missionary, Charles Cook, and acknowledge that even if the church wasn't engaged in egregious acts, such as handing out smallpox blankets, still they played a role in our colonization. They played a role in the suppression of medicine men. They played a role in the suppression of ceremony and language. And so, in light of these things, I think Vine would want the church to want to take proactive steps to redeem itself for its sins and to try to give back to the Indian community those things that it's taken from us. So Vine actually proposed to churches during this time that wherever possible, the church should give land back. Because there's a lot of, when you look at the status of the church in Indian country, my reservation, for example, there are still churches out there, right? You still go to places, I can still go to places that I went to as a child to be with my family. But when you look at what's going on at these churches today, there's hardly any congregation there. There's hardly any congregation there. And so Vine suggested to the church, because this was going on during his time, he said that it would probably be wise for these churches in the reservation community to consolidate their efforts into fewer churches and to give the remaining churches the land and the property back to the community. And this is like, that would go a long way at telling people that the church actually cares about the impact that it's had on the community. Just giving land back, just giving land back would be huge.
Mm-hmm. And just so you know, David, the ELCA 2 years ago during our churchwide assembly passed a memorial on land back. And so we're beginning those conversations with different congregations and our synodical bishops to look at potential opportunities for land back when our churches close or the properties close. And so I love that you said that. We can all say that much louder so that people can start a movement and moving on this. So thank you so much for affirming and in supporting in that way. I appreciate that so much. All right. Well, thank you all so much. That concludes our questions that I'm going to ask, and I thought it was important for folks to hear. And I think we have an excellent now library of answers that will also be passing out to folks through this recording. But we have some questions in the Q&A that have come to us. And this one is, I'm going to give to Manuel. Does the Native community view the Lutheran Church as still in missionary mode or more a partner and ally?
Well, when many of our churches in the Lutheran Church still have mission on their title of their churches, I think that's still very much a missionary mode. When we're still sending out people to these congregations or not part of the community, I think they're still in missionary mode. And even, yeah, it's hard for me to get out of the missionary mode because I think that's where we still are. We have not really moved past that. There's been a lot of work to make that change over the last few decades. But it's still, I would say the church is still very much in missionary mode. Yeah, that's all I can say about that. And I think that it actually goes back to the fact that, as David referenced, that with the Presbyterian Church and with his tribe and his space and Cook being there, the way that the churches divided up our people on this continent, and it's, like the Episcopals said, we'll take these people and you take these people, and that consolidation, instead of having it be any kind of our choice about what church and people were going to come into our community or be part of our community. That's a huge part of it. It's hard to get out of that space of being a missionary church to our people if you can't even remove that yet. So I think that land back piece is part of unraveling for it.
Indeed.
Thank you.
Yeah, thank you. Of course, I have tons of opinion. The only thing I'll say is that we have taken tiny steps in recent years by creating the position that was created for me, or not for me, but the position I took that was created in the way that it was, that I accepted as the Director of Indigenous Ministries and Tribal Relations, of which Manuel and Pastor Joanne and others were part of reshaping. And so instead of us thinking about, well, we still responsible for taking care of Indigenous ministries, but the larger part of my job is supposed to be, when I'm not educating white people in the church, it's supposed to be tribal relations. So looking at how we understand ourselves as a church that's in relationship with a sovereign nation, not unlike how sovereign tribal nations are in relationship with the federal government or even state governments. And so that is a step in the right direction. But I would agree with Pastor Manuel for a variety of reasons that I could also list, make a very long list. We're still very much in missionary mode, and usually it has to do with people's white supremacy, individuals and the system, and that's just the way it's always been done, and not trusting when Native people want to help them reshape their thinking. And so that's where I'll stop, because I could go on forever about that. That's what I do day to day. So thank you, Pastor. Another question, and I want to give this one to David here. Who are some contemporary authors you'd recommend for Indigenous folks, non-Indigenous folks who appreciated Custer Died for Your Sins? Humor is not required, of course, but is a wonderful aspect of Custer.
Wow. The first book that comes to mind, it's actually a difficult book to read, but a very important one. And that's Sarah Deer's The Beginning and Ending of Rape. I regard that book as probably being the most important book to come out since Custer itself, just because of how that work, which focuses on sexual violence against Native women, and connects that to the history of colonization itself as being a paradigm shift. After reading that book and teaching it to my students, we just finished it not too long ago. It's probably why it's front and center of my mind. I can't think about colonization without thinking about the devastation, the impact of colonization on Native women, and the role that the assault on Native women played in colonization itself. And so a lot of our problems as a community stem from this historical trauma. And we really can't talk about restoration or healing or resiliency or rebuilding our nations or revitalizing our culture without talking about the role of women in all of the things that we do. And so if you were affected by Custer, if it changed your thinking, and you want to reach somebody who, in my opinion, has that same level of effect on your intellect, your spirit, I would read her work.
Great, fantastic. And there are, of course, many other incredible books that are written. Some of the ones that are, I think, pretty poignant, that are contemporary, though they're not maybe the same genre, but more fiction. But I just want to offer up books like Tommy Orange's books, which are There, and also Shooting Stars. Just to the way in which he writes. So this is significant for me. The way in which he writes is very, I just say Indian. And there's a tone and the way in which he tells the story is kind of how some of us talk when we're not talking to white people. That it's just a beautiful pattern that he uses. And so while it's not an academic book, it's certainly, I think, valuable this time as contemporary writer in our midst, and will probably produce many, many more for us. So I would offer that. Also, I'll put in the chat also a link to, I guess it's already been put there, a link to the bookshop, Native Reads, which has both contemporary and not so contemporary books listed, and all by Native writers. And so I want to make sure that you see that there for other resources or other books to check out. All right. So a couple more questions here. One, This is for Pastor Manuel again, and it's kind of connected to what we've already talked about, but I think it's worth at least asking the question and reflecting just a little bit on. As Indigenous leaders in the church, are you seeing yourselves heard and included in all aspects of the ELCA?
Yes, I mean, I think there are some places where I feel like we're being heard. But there's many other places where I don't feel we have a voice at all. It's been, one of the things that we at some churches, some seminaries, some of our seminaries, even with land acknowledgements, it seems like such a simple thing to do, and I don't feel like I should have to ask for it to be there, but so often I find myself asking, so why wasn't there a land acknowledgement for this event? And that's even within my own synod. So, I mean, that's just one example of many, and often not even, I mean, the invisibility that I feel often as a Native person within a room, with many other church leaders in the church, that don't even see my nativeness or being Indian or my being Cherokee. It's just kind of that it is the racism of if I don't, that I don't see color, so they don't even acknowledge that we're there. And that it happens more often than not, sadly.
Mm-hmm. Thank you. And this will be a question for David. It's a unique question, and Vine, of course, touches on it a bit, but I'd be interested in hearing your take, either from Vine's perspective or yours. How is the, quote, Indian grandmother complex, end quote, a product of racism, question mark, who for years my family didn't acknowledge their Native American heritage. My ancestor wasn't a Cherokee princess, and she was never spoken of as such. But how does having her in my ancestry affect my relationship with Native Americans? And so I mean, I'm really interested in hearing, because I think it's becoming a bigger and bigger conversation about who's Indian, who's not, a little bit. And so I'd be interested in hearing your perspective.
Yeah. Well, there are different ways of responding to the Indian grandmother tradition, custom. One is in terms of how very rarely in this country has there been much value placed on being an Indigenous person. And so it's not unusual to find families, maybe even whole communities, that had a connection, an actual connection to a Native community, that omit it or even renounce their connection to that community because there was no social value in claiming Indian identity. At the same time, the other response to that phenomenon is that, and this is the issue of racism, the tradition of the Indian grandmother is a tradition of appropriating Indian heritage for the purpose of claiming legitimacy to the land that your ancestors have taken, meaning white American ancestors have taken. And so how this sprung up in the first place, I'm sure somebody studied it, but how this sprung up in the first place is probably largely lost in the mist of history. But it's become a way of validating people's needs to feel, I guess they need to feel connected to the land in which they're calling home. And perhaps to, I don't know, alleviate their guilt that they're living on stolen land. And so claiming an Indian grandmother or great grandmother is a way of justifying, the life that you've been able to enjoy on somebody else's homeland. And so for those families that have given up, claiming Indian, maybe they're passing now, you know, they're doing so, for similar reasons. There's no value in being a real Indian anymore in this country. Yeah, and so they've kind of renounced their legacy and their identity. And so it's complicated, this issue that we've been dealing with a lot today, which is ethnic fraud and playing Indian. And so because of how much damage that colonization has done to Native communities, including destroying families and communities themselves. When it comes to claiming an indigenous identity, by and large, the criteria, the method that we're obliged to use to validate somebody's claim to being Indian are those criteria, those methods that the colonizer himself has given us. So when you look at, say, the criteria for enrollment in any given tribe, including references to blood quantum, you got to ask yourself, if you don't know any better, where did these things come from? And so a lot of people are being judged on their Indianness based on ideas, really racist ideas like blood quantum, that have no origin or relevance in the Native community itself. And so it's just exacerbating the damage that colonization has done, to our sense of self. So maybe we take some solace in thinking that we have an Indian grandmother.
Yeah. I had an Indian grandmother. I had a great grandma.
Me too.
I had a great grandma who was Cherokee, and she was not a princess. And so we didn't have those princesses. And so, but thank you for that answer and for naming that, quite frankly, so succinctly, things that it sometimes takes a long time to explain to folks. And so thank you for that. I have one other question here. That I'm going to answer myself, just because it becomes a commercial for us. What can we as members of individual congregations do to encourage a presentation like this at the synodical level of the ELCA? There's a variety of things you can do. I would encourage you to email me to have that conversation offline here. I'm happy to help encourage you and give you ideas for how to make that happen. But it's important for you to know, if you've not already been doing so, knowing about ELCA's website, our Indigenous Ministries and Tribal Relations website, elca.org/indigenous, which has many resources for you to utilize to do some teaching and to share with those around you in your synods and your congregations. We also, of course, have elca.org/truth and healing. And that is connected to the Indigenous webpage as well. There we have, for those of you who don't know, have had for the last 2 years educational activities, many of which are recorded and can be found on the YouTube playlist, which you'll find at that webpage. But the goal would be for us to have folks be at these events that we're producing, whether it be the Vine Deloria Junior Theological Symposium in partnership with LSTC and the Perot Center, or other events that we are hosting, panels, other presentations and keynotes, classes that we may be hosting around different topics. And so spreading that information across your audiences and networks would be fantastic. And I think if you could do that first, that would be a beautiful gift. And then, of course, like I said, happy to have conversation with you about how potentially getting presentations at your synodical events would be something I'd welcome as well. Just email me when you can email me at elca.org/ you can find the opportunity to email me at elca.org/indigenous, which I believe the links have put in the chat for us. All right, folks. Well, this has been fantastic. I just want to say it's yet another incredible moment in the history of the church, in the history of LSTC, to bring together some brilliant minds and some beautiful, compassionate, loving, caring folks who want folks to know and to do better. So I just want to say thank you to David and to Manuel and to Allie, who has been a warrior this evening. I know she's not been feeling well with that dental work that she had done, but Allie, thank you for powering through for us this evening. Your words are a gift. As all of you have shared, I'm so grateful for all of what you've given to us. And so if we could maybe give a round of applause to our panelists this evening, shake our hands here, maybe some hearts, some comments in the chat are coming through if you folks want to check those out. My mother just said she feels like a princess. How funny. She's not a great yet. All right. So she's great, but not a great yet. And so just want to say thank you again to our panelists. Thank you to LSTC, Dr. Neiman, and the Paro Center, the staff there. I got an email from Dr. Linda Thomas, who's the director of the Paro Center, as well as being dean of LSTC, just who says she's here in spirit. She's over in Palestine right now, but thank you to her for her support over the years. And so again, thank you all. Thank you, David, Manuel, Allie. I can't say it enough. I'm so grateful for your presence here, your words, your wisdom to make yet another Vine Deloria Junior Theological Symposium a beautiful, beautiful moment. So thank you so much. And with that, we'll say wado, 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 wado. Have a good night, folks. Thanks for being here.
You, that was great. Thank you. Good night.
Thank you, Vance, for organizing all this.
Yeah, thank you.
Good
This was
work.
great. Good work. It was awesome.
Thank you.
Great conversation.
Thank you so much.
Great.
Yeah, great conversation.
Thank you so much. Thank you.
Mhm.
Thank you. Thank you.